You're listening to The Leonard Lopate Show on AM 820 and 93.9 WNYC.
1 out of every 6 people on the planet lives on $1 a day, and the overwhelming majority of those people work extremely hard at unsafe jobs to earn barely enough to survive and support their families. In his book, Living on $1 a Day, The Lives Behind the Faces of the World's Poor, Thomas A. Nazario visits some often overlooked communities around the world, and he's accompanied his personal profiles with photographs by Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer Renee C. Beyer. They document the everyday realities of individuals living in extreme poverty. The book is published by Quantock Lane Press, and I'm very pleased to welcome author, attorney, child advocate, and law professor Thomas A. Nazario to our show today. Hello.
Thank you for having me.
Did you intend this to be something of a modern update of Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, which had a text by James Agee and photographs by Walker Evans?
I suspect, you could say that. You could argue that. One of my original intention was, let me back up a second. I've spent a lot of time traveling the world and seeing a lot of poverty. Yet when I come to the United States, certainly we have poverty here, but the media spends an extraordinary amount of time talking about the rich and the famous, the celebrities, the gossip, who's marrying who's kissing who. And inasmuch as the world's poor make up such a huge percentage of the world's population, I just felt that they were being ignored, somewhat forgotten. And I wanted to bring their stories, their photographs, their lives to people who wouldn't ordinarily meet them. That was the purpose of this book.
The photographs are beautiful. How did you and the photographer Renee Beyer come to collaborate on this?
Well, I run a foundation. We decided to do this project. We put out a notice that we were looking for a photographer. Originally, we were going to hire about 4 or 5 photographers to travel to different parts of the world all at once. We came across Renee. She and I had done some work together prior to that, but we loved her photograph. She's absolutely great. Again, she's won the Pulitzer Prize for much of her work. And she convinced us that the book would be better if one photographer took all the photos. It would be more seamless that way. So the project
And it should be her.
Right, and it should be her. and we have not regretted that decision. The book is beautiful, and it took a little longer to do it because she had to travel all over, but nevertheless, we have a great product.
And it's a large format book to accommodate those photographs.
That's right.
As you mentioned, you're the founder and president of a nonprofit organization called the Forgotten International. What is its mission?
Well, its mission is to lift people out of poverty. We actually work in about 7 different countries, but we go to places where people wouldn't ordinarily go. We go to small villages. We go to slums in large cities. We go to places that, for whatever reason, either the government or the communities in and around that area have paid these folks very little attention.
Well, what can an NGO do? You're an NGO, right? Or, what can you do to lift people out of poverty that big governments can't do?
Well, I think what we do is we essentially do a very, very personal job. We only fund programs that we've spent some time with, visited with, trust. We fund very small organizations that need help getting from point A to point B, need help getting large funding later. We fund the Mother Teresas of the world who work in a little clinic or school that you're trying to start. We fund scholarships for children, schools that particularly fund young girls. So we work on a very, very basic level. Large organizations usually work with other large organizations. Governments, of course, work with very, very large agencies of one kind or another, and a lot of people do not trust governments, and so they come to us because we have that more personal touch.
And how did you wind up creating this foundation?
How did I what?
Wind up creating it. I mean, you're an attorney. You also are an academic. Which came first?
Well, certainly being an attorney came first and teaching thousands of students over the years. But I wrote a book some years ago called In Defense of Children.
And there are a lot of children in this book.
That's right. That's right. And in the process of writing that book, I became at least temporarily famous. and I was put on a committee to work with the United Nations and examine various countries of the world and how they treated their children. And in the process of doing that, I met the Dalai Lama. He and I became friends some 15 years ago. And vis-a-vis a variety of conversations I had with him, it became important for me to do more than sit around a classroom and talk to students.
And I didn't mention that the Dalai Lama wrote the foreword to this book. That's a real get, as we say in this business. But then you decided to limit this book to people who live on $1 a day. So that would eliminate the United States. As poor as people are here, they have to live on a little more than $1 a day. So you went to places in Europe, Asia, and South America. How common is it to find people who live on just $1 a day?
Well, certainly if you go to certain countries, it's very, very common. In fact, there are countries in the world where upwards of 60, 70, 80% of the people in those countries live on less than $1 a day. Somalia is one of those countries. Liberia is another, so on and so forth. So we chose 10 countries to visit. India, by the way, has the largest number of impoverished people.
And that comes as a surprise because India is one of the countries that we think of as having a developing and booming economy. And although there obviously was a lot of dissatisfaction with the way the country was going, as reflected by the recent elections there, I never think of it as a country where people live on $1 a day.
Many live on far less than $1 a day, and you find them all over the streets, living under plastic tents. You find them near rivers, where, of course, they obtain their water or swim. They essentially live all over India. There's somewhere between 220 million to 300 million people in that country alone who live on less than $1 a day. And the truth of the matter is that we've talked to some members of Parliament there, and frankly, some members of Parliament don't seem to care. They just feel like they're either Daleks, who are, of course, the lowest caste in that country, and
called
feel
untouchables.
Exactly. And some people have told us that, we have over 200 million people who live on our streets or on our roadways, and if they died tomorrow or just left, we wouldn't miss them at all. So part of poverty is really simply not caring on the part of individuals who have far more than they need, or governments who simply take money and not use it in manners in which it was intended.
Did you find that callousness in most of the countries that that are represented here? Romania, no. Bolivia?
Certainly some, yeah. Not to the extent that we found it in India.
Romania was a surprise because it's a European country, and although I know it has a lot to recover from the Ceausescu years, still it is part of the European community.
And part of course, the European Union. And one of the problems it had in getting admitted to the European Union, however, was its poverty and the amount of people who live in sewers in that country. They live underground. They live in heating vents. And it's because of the history of poverty that existed and the amount of, Ceausescu decided to, probably 25 years ago, it was his mission to create a powerful country, and he forced women to have at least 5 children. They then had far more children than they knew what to do with. Those children ended up in streets or in orphanages, and we now have 2 generations of people who live underground in sewers.
One of the surprises for me in looking over the photos here were how many people were smiling despite the awful conditions of their lives.
Yeah, I think that surprised us as well. We didn't find a great correlation between wealth and the lack of wealth and joy. In many cases, particularly children, even though they were very impoverished, laughed, played. That was not a problem.
My guest is Thomas A. Nazario, whose book, Living on $1 a Day, The Lives Behind the Faces of the World's Poor, has photographs by Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer Renee C. Beyer and a foreword by the Dalai Lama. You mentioned that there are people in some governments who really don't think that we should be concerned about these people, but all of us see really poor people at one point or another, whether it's in where we live or when on our travels. And I wonder how many of these people wind up becoming invisible to us.
Well, I think a lot of people decide to block it out, to walk by, to not look. I'd like to say that more people care or more people have time to care, but the truth of the matter is that many of us feel we don't, or many of us feel that our life is difficult enough. One of the things that the Dalai Lama has spoken to me about was the fact that caring and compassion, being nice, being respectful is one thing, but being willing to actually relieve the suffering of someone else, that's what's critically important, and that's what this book tries to do. It tries to move people to action.
Well, thinking about India again and its booming economy, why does economic development seem to always leave the poorest people behind?
Well, I'm not absolutely sure that's true. It's easy to...
Well, isn't it supposed to, rising waters supposed to lift all boats?
Well, certainly everyone has been telling us lately, and I think there's a lot of truth to this, that the rich are getting richer, and there's far more billionaires on the planet now than ever before, and we have nevertheless forgotten the poor. The poor are doing somewhat better than they have been doing in the last 30 or 40 years. In fact, 35 years ago, we were losing about 40,000 children a day to preventable diseases and hunger. Today, that number is about 19,000 children a day. So we've made a large improvement in that area. We've made some improvement in Africa because there are more children in schools, there are more children getting an education, and there are more countries, even in Africa, that have governments that are at least akin to a democracy.
Do the poorest people tend to live in urban or rural areas?
The poorest people in the world live in rural areas.
In slums? Oh, no, in
the countryside.
Areas.
In fact, 55% of the poorest people in the world are subsistence farmers.
Well, but we hear about people moving to the cities in great numbers.
That's right.
Does that help their conditions, their situation?
That is changing. And in fact, as you probably know, about 5 years ago, we hit a tipping point, and there are now more people living in cities throughout the world than in rural areas. And some people say, well, we might be able to do something about poverty if we just take the poor that are living in rural areas and bring them into cities where they might have a chance of getting a job. That wouldn't work, at least not immediately.
Now, often when this issue comes up and there are big conferences, the poorer countries blame the wealthier countries for their situation.
There's some truth to that. I mean, if we look at the rich countries, they're still owed a lot of money by the poor countries, so there's a debt problem with regards to impoverished countries. There's a lot of exploitation that still takes place. We take a lot of natural resources from many poor countries, and we use them to sustain our standard of living here as well as in the Western world. So it wouldn't be difficult to make that argument. And in the same way that rich individuals are getting richer and poor people seem to be getting poorer, at least to some extent, rich countries are getting richer and poor countries are getting poorer.
On the other hand, many of these countries are kleptocracies. The governments are corrupt. Some of them are total dictatorships. So the money never trickles down. In Nigeria right now, we're seeing serious problems. No way would I ever defend Boko Haram, but they got started because of real anger toward the fact that they were living in such bad conditions, and the government wasn't helping them.
It's one of the poorest countries in the world.
Even though it's oil rich.
It's oil rich. We have no idea, but we have at least some idea where that money's going. It's not going in the right places. So it's one of these obstacles to poverty alleviation, because no one like you or I would probably want to donate millions of dollars to that country because we don't know where the money's going.
We are seeing tuberculosis, serious problems with tuberculosis, and more recently polio is making a comeback. How much of this is just based on the fact that these people are living in such terrible conditions?
Well, certainly that's true with polio. Not so true with, well, no, excuse me. It's certainly true with tuberculosis, not so true with polio. Polio is just very, very difficult to wipe out. It's like it's trying to grab a piece of clay. If you squeeze it, it'll always slip out one place or another. So it seems to be slipping into other countries, in spite of the fact that Bill and Melinda Gates have made some great efforts in that regard.
How many of the people living on $1 a day or working for $1 a day or less are children?
Well, the largest percentage of people in the world who are extremely poor are women and children. About 60% of the world's poorest people are women and children. What percentage of that is children as opposed to women, I'm not absolutely sure.
Well, if international laws exist mandating the rights of the child, then why has the world's legal community been slow to enforce it when it comes to child labor?
Well, I'm not sure it's been slow, but the truth of the matter is that the world is still governed by sovereign nations, that international law is not as powerful as one would think, that a lot of the international law is aspirational in nature. We hope to get there someday. We try to enforce these laws. We do it by embarrassing countries or institutions. But maybe in another 20 or 40 or 50 years, things will be much better.
You mentioned that women and children suffer, but are situations all that much better for men in these communities?
Well, to some extent, yes, they are. They are better. Men still rule the world, particularly in family settings, particularly in cultures that are somewhat older than ours, possibly. Women don't have the same rights as men. Many women lose their property rights upon marriage. They still have to do all of the household work. They still seldom get paid for any of that kind of work. Men still control the money. So, yes, in terms of women's rights and men's rights, men seem to possess most of those rights. So it's more and more difficult for women, yes.
Thomas A. Nazario's book, Living on $1 a Day, The Lives Behind the Faces of the World's Poor, is published by Quantum Lane Press, which is a division of W.W. Norton. It's a gorgeous book, and it has a foreword by the Dalai Lama, photographs by Renee C. Beyer, who's a Pulitzer Prize winner. My great thanks to you for being on our show.
Oh, thanks for having me.